Good afternoon, and welcome to On the Real Side, our podcast where I get to talk to a lot of my favorite cats, people often that I've known for a long time. And, we play together and everything. We have little conversations and maybe have a drink of wine together or something, but we don't really get to know each other in depth and ask each other the kind of questions and maybe discuss some things that we have, have covered together, but separately. And I'm honored today to have one of the great jazz bass players, um, Mr. Gene Perla, with us. And Gene's work has been distinguished through the years with stints with Elvin Jones, Sarah Vaughan, Nina Simone, all kinds of people, plus his own group with Don Elias and often Steve Grossman, the late great Steve Grossman, called Stone Alliance. And Gene remains active. Uh, and I just was looking at your schedule, and you're busier than some teenagers are. You're you're working a lot. Plus, Gene has also, over the years, become quite an authority, and has taught courses in the music business, which I'm always reminded whenever I think of the music business. I always think of something that Ornette said, that one should draw the distinction that the music business is not the business of music, but they are intertwined. And Gene has found a way of combining these things and, being able to educate people about how the business relates to musicians. I personally wish I'd have taken his course about 40 years ago, but would have helped me out a lot. Well, to begin kind of at the beginning, Gene I think you came to the music sort of like what Bill Evans might call a late bloomer, in the way that, you weren't like a 12-year-old. I know you were playing music, but you came from Jersey. But where in Jersey did you grow up, actually?
A small town called Woodcliff Lake, which is in Bergen County. It's about 22 miles from Harlem.
From Harlem, and is it Bergen County? Is that near Patterson?
Not so far away. Patterson's a little further south and to the west.
Okay. And you came from, is your family Italian on both sides?
Yeah, there's some mixes of German and French in there as well. But my father was from Italy. He was born there, and my mother's father was born in Italy.
So, and what did your dad do?
He was a mason,
Uh-huh.
and he worked for his brother when he first came to this country, and he showed me some of the buildings that he worked on during the WPA projects, and then
We called the Wobblies then.
What's that?
They were called the Wobblies, right?
I don't know that. Yeah,
Yeah,
I don't know that. Yeah. And in his later years, he had his own business with a partner who was a plasterer. So they used to do that. They even, did foundations of houses, but a lot of smaller jobs they did, the two of them.
And your mother was basically a stay-at-home mother?
Well, she was stay at home, but she had her own business. She was a dress designer. And when she was young, she had Mrs. Lindbergh as a customer. And in her later years, because Yogi Berra lived in the same town, Mrs. Berra was one of her customers.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
And did you have siblings? Did you come from a larger family?
No, I'm one and only. That's it.
One and only.
Yeah.
And was music encouraged? Did your parents play any music? Was it?
No, my father not, and my mother also not, but she wanted to expose me to it. So she started me on piano lessons at 5 years old.
And then you were actually, you went to University of Toledo for a year as a kind of business major. And then you got the inclination to go to Berkeley after that.
Right.
What kind of, as a piano player, who were you listening to? Were you majoring in classical music? When did you first hear jazz or who was influencing you?
I first heard jazz through a young lady who was a couple of years behind me in high school, and she played in the band. She played alto saxophone, and we became friendly. And she invited me over to her house one day, and she put on this record of the Ted Heath big band out of the UK. And I was so amazed at the feeling of all these players, a big band swinging like that. And that's what got me started in terms of liking the music.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And you actually got to go to a concert of them. Is that true? And you heard the band live?
Yes, that's right. On their first tour of the States, unbeknownst to me, because by that point, I think I had 12 or 13 of his albums. Wow. And unbeknownst to me, my mom contacted him while he was in the UK because I or she or someone heard that he was coming on his first tour of the States. And she contacted him. And when the show was over at Carnegie Hall, she took me around to the stage door and we went inside and I got to meet him and Johnny Hawksworth, the bass player, and a couple of other guys in the band. So I'm super thrilled, right?
Wow. So then you went to Berkeley, and an interesting thing I read in your bio that was interesting was that you sort of came into jazz almost through the back door, in the sense that, it said you first really were impressed by the bass and the idea of playing the bass through Charlie Hayden's work with Ornette on The Shape of Jazz to Come.
Correct.
A lot of people, start out with Paul Chambers, Oscar Pettiford, and then kind of head further from Scott LaFaro, they jump into Charlie and do that. But you seem to have started with that. Is that kind of the way it was?
I mean, the reason why I became a bass player was that I went to Berkeley to be Bill Evans too. Right. And I'm there for a couple of years and I'm realizing it's coming down hard on me. There's no way I'm going to be Bill Evans too. And so a friend of mine introduced me to that Ornette record, Shape of Jazz to Come, and with no chord, right? Just trumpet, alto, saxophone, and drums and bass. And just listening to Charlie outlining the harmony that I was able to understand, even though I didn't know the music, but I could hear him outlining chords. And the pulse that he had was so full and fat. And I says, oh man, I could do this. I think I could really do this. So the next day I went to the Berkeley and I said, I quit piano and I went and bought a $600 K bass and started breaking my hands.
That's wild. That's great. And so then, now when you were at Berkeley, it was kind of an interesting period because it hadn't been that long since it had been Schillinger House, right? It made that transition into being Berkeley. You were kind of a part of an early class of Berkeley. And who were some of the other cats that that were going to Berkeley at the time? I mean, I knew there were bass players around Boston. I don't know if you overlapped with them, but I mean, George Mraz and Miroslav.
No, I was before them.
You were before them.
Yeah, the biggest name that was, well, actually, he wasn't at that time, but the biggest name that was a student along with me was Keith Jarrett. And in fact, we had a little trio, little meaning it was just he and I and a saxophone player. His name was Bob Carducci, who could play that saxophone as fast as Keith could play the piano. Wow. And I just started playing bass at that time, and they're playing these confirmation at 9,000 miles an hour, and I'm playing like whole notes,
Right, just trying to hang in there.
But the other fellow that was there that really had a big name already was Sadao Watanabe from Japan, the alto saxophonist. Sure. Yeah.
Now, was Charlie Mariano teaching at Berkeley at that point?
No, he was not.
Because Sadao always sounded a little like Charlie to me. Mm-hmm. He sounded like he had quite an influence from Charlie. Mm-hmm. And my good friend Yoshiaki Masuo, who you may have worked with with Masuo. I'm not sure if you guys were on that band together, but he played a lot with Sadao in Japan. Mm. And Gary Burton wasn't there either yet, right?
No, he wasn't. Not when I was there. No.
Right. So then uh, you started listening after you heard Charlie. Did you kind of sort of make it a project to hear other great bass players and kind of go back and did you was John Neves around?
Oh yeah, he was there and his brother. Yeah,
Right, Paul, piano player. Yeah.
yeah, yeah.
Did you? I mean, I was wondering who mentored you, as a bass player, or encouraged you. Anybody you practiced with, or did John Neves? Did you actually study with anybody there, or you kind of just picked
I
it up on your
I
own?
took one lesson from the bass teacher at Berkeley, and he showed me how to hold the bass. He showed me how to place my hands on the fingerboard, and he showed me how to hold a bow. Right, and that was it. I had one lesson, and I hadn't, all through the rest of the time, it was all on me. I didn't take any lessons from anyone, and I just kept working at playing it myself.
So then you had a kind of first band that you kind of were part of, which was called Los Muchachos,
Right,
right? And that had Mark Levine,
right,
and who was the guy who wrote those piano books.
right,
A lot of people know him from that. And then your lifelong friend, and my real good friend too, Don Elias,
right.
which we could write a book about Don. He was a very unique,
Tremendous, tremendous musician.
tremendous cat. Yeah,
Yeah,
and so that's when you and he originally hooked up,
right.
and you did that for what, around a year or so in Boston, and then
Yeah, it's maybe a year, maybe a year and a half, something like that. Yeah.
now did Don go to New York first, or did you? How others? What drove you? Now you're going to move to New York,
Right.
and what were the circumstances of you deciding to go to New York?
Um, well, once the bug bit me and I went to Berkeley, then it was like 110% jazz and listening to everything I could possibly lay my hands on, going to the clubs when the bands would come through town, and we always had a couple of jazz clubs around there. Lenny's on the Turnpike was one that was a little out of town. The Jazz Workshop and Paul's
Yeah.
Mall, right? Yeah, they were downtown. And
Right, Williams was in Peabody, as I recall.
yeah, I believe that's the town that Lenny's was at. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
And
Did you get to know Jackie Byard at all up there, or?
no, I didn't. No. Yeah, yeah.
But that kind of, you decided you were going to go to New York.
Yeah, well, listening to records, and then getting my thing somewhat together, where I was starting to feel comfortable that I could push myself out there and try and find work, play with other people, and listening to these records, I came to the conclusion of with a dream, and that dream was to go to New York to play with two people in particular. And number one was Elvin Jones, the drummer. And the second person, which I never thought ever I would have a chance to play with him, because I started so late on the instrument, and there were so many other players who were technically, and still to this day, light years ahead of me, was Miles Davis, but it turned out that I got to play with both of them in the end. Yeah.
Yeah, I wondered, when we were talking the other day, we actually didn't really talk about the Miles experience. How did that come about, and for how long, and what was who was on the band, and what was your general feeling about it?
Well, it was a one-shot deal. That was it. Don was in town staying with me at my loft, and we got up one morning and he said, "I'm doing a date with Miles. You want to come along?" I said, "Sure." So I had a gig later that night, and took my electric bass with me, fortunately. And I'm sitting in the control room, and Michael Henderson, who was Miles's bass player at the time, he's not showing up. So well after an hour, I hear the microphones are open in the studio, and I hear Don say to Miles, he says, "There's a bass player sitting in the control room." And Miles said, "Tell him to get his ass in here." So I went in, and Miles sang me this line. That was the whole tune. and I picked it up pretty quickly, and it was called Ali, and it was finally released some years later. It wasn't on the original Jack Johnson album,
Wow.
but it did come out later. What was curious was when, as soon as I picked up the bass line, then he felt that I, had it under control. As he walked away, he said, "Don't make it swing." so so if you hear that track, it's really kind of Ricky Tick.
That's an interesting comment, isn't it?
Yeah.
And you never played with him again? You never, that was your Zen experience, kind of.
Well, I had other experiences with him. One was a business experience, and I'd see him once in a while and say hello, but that was the only time I played with him. Yes.
Yeah. So then you're in New York, and Don is there, and there's a whole young crop of people coming up. I mean, people like, well, Chick Corea and Joe Henderson and those people that are around, and you're making these sessions. You had a loft.
Yes.
And there were sessions. I may have even, at some point, I know I played with you at Liebman's old loft when Brecker had it.
Ah.
I think we played, that's when I may have actually played with you for the first time.
Okay.
But, I mean, there were like a lot of sessions. I know Liebman was doing those things at the Village Gate late at night, like at 2 a.m. or something. They would start and play this very free kind of stuff with Mike and Randy and Liebs and Al Foster and different cats. That was going on.
Mm-hmm.
And I was younger than everybody, so I would now and then maybe play a little bit, but I didn't. I mostly listened to those.
Mm-hmm.
Tried to understand what the hell everybody was doing.
Yeah.
But so you were there, and you who were the cats that like you kind of gravitated to as friends? I know you mentioned that you knew Chick, pre-Scientology Chick.
Yeah, well, in fact, I moved to New York, but not actually in the city. I rented a house just across, literally just across the George Washington Bridge. You got off that first exit, and there was a dead-end street. At the end of that street was this house, and I rented it and would make my way into New York back and forth. But finally, I rented a loft in the East Village for 4 months because it belonged to a dancer, and he got a commission to go to Africa for the summer. And so I rented it from him. And I called Don. I said, "Come down, man, come on down, this weekend." And
he was still in Boston.
Well, no, he was working at a hospital in Providence, Rhode Island. He was living in Providence.
Really?
Yeah. And well, he had a family and kids, right?
I didn't know that about him.
Oh yeah.
That he had done that early.
Yeah. I'm still in touch with the kids and the first wife and the second wife and the third wife.
I picked up on the third one. Mireille was the last wife
there was one after that.
There was one after that. Okay.
Yeah. Anyway, that very first night, he came down, and we were, playing around, just the two of us, and it was midnight, and there was a knock at the door. And what he had done, he had called Chick, who I didn't know. And I went and opened the door, and there was Chick with Joe Farrell. And they came in. We had a jam session right then.
Oh, it was been beautiful.
So Chick liked the way I played, and he then invited me to come out to his house in Queens. And I went out there 2, sometimes 3 times a week, and we'd rehearse in his basement. And I learned so much from that man. And then, we did some gigs, and we recorded together with Eldon a few times. So it was really, it was just wonderful that I knew him.
Chick was a very kind man. There was something that just in knowing Chick, my first impression of him was like, gee, this is a genuinely kind human being,
Yeah.
And, so that must have been that. So that was really kind of your mentor in a way, like Chick kind of was sort of bringing you along.
Absolutely. There's some things that he taught me that served me to this day.
I'm sure.
Yeah.
And then there was gruff Joe Ferrantello, who used to crack me up. I loved him. I told you, he used to call me Chirp. He'd say, "Bird chirped." I was making little squeaks one night. He'd say, "You're chirp off the old bird." and I think I told you that I said to him one night, he used to come down to Strikers because I was playing with Chet right around on the Upper West Side near where Joe lived. And then when his wife left and she became a Jehovah's Witness, that was really a trip
Mm.
for him. But one time I said, "So Joe," just to making conversation, I said, "So you're married, you got kids, and does what does your wife do? What do you mean? What does my wife do? She's my old lady. That's what she does."
Mhm. Mhm.
And he had that kind of thing. But
Mhm.
um, but I imagine musically, musically, I think Joe was very underrated. Mike Brecker and I used to go hear Joe, and we were always just knocked out. I used to go, as a matter of fact, when in '68, when I came to New York, like originally, I would hang out at the Half Note, and behind the Half Note was a place called Pookie's Pub. And you must have come in there. That was a trio with Joe and Jimmy Garrison and Elvin, and they played, I think, most of the weeknights because I would leave the Half Note. I go hear Roy Eldridge, sometimes sit in with Roy or Zoot. I was 16, and then I go across the street, and Roberta Garrison would let me sit at her table. She said I was family, so I could sit, so they didn't throw me out because I was underage. And I heard that Elvin got mad one night and kind of tore the place apart. That I hadn't been there for that. But did you get to know Jimmy at all?
Garrison, no, I refer to him as a friend of mine. Absolutely, yes. Yeah,
Yeah,
we had a nice warm relationship. It's like I didn't hang out with him, but whenever I'd see him, it was just 100% honest.
yeah, he was a beautiful person. I got to actually know him, and he would actually come down from Harlem, and he was in my first band, and he would bring his bass on the subway because I couldn't afford to give him a taxi or anything, and he would take that bass on the subway, and practice with me in my little basement apartment on McDougal Street, for hours. And my first wife would make us a spaghetti dinner or something, and and he was just always just so encouraging and nice to me, and you'd learn a lot just by. He had a big beat, didn't he? He had this kind of feeling of wideness. You have that in your time too. I think that's what Elvin liked about it. That some cats play, but they play a sort of narrow time feeling, and you had a more expansive kind of thing in your feeling for time.
Mm.
That Jimmy also had that type of that type of thing.
Mhm.
So were there any other cats like, so you've got Jimmy and you've got Chick, and you're kind of finding a coterie. I guess you met Liebman around that time, and
Yes, because in the building next to me that I rented for that summer was Bob Moses, the drummer.
right, the
And
story
so
of Moses.
I believe that's where I met Lieb at a session at his place.
Uh,
Yeah.
Moses has one of my favorite album titles ever, "When Elephants Dream of Music." I think that was a wonderful name for a record. And yeah, so they were hanging out a lot. I remember that period too. And then you went with Willie Bobo, right? That was kind of your bread and butter gig, and you got to know Potato Valdez. Uh, Tell me a little bit about that. Like, so you hadn't really, I guess, Los Muchachos must have had some Latin roots in just the name itself. I guess you were playing.
Well, Los Muchachos was an authentic dance band, and that's where we played in these rooms, or played in a couple of different rooms with them. The band was run by the saxophonist and singer, flutist, Dick Meza. And it was an authentic dance band. That's what it was. So I learned all those
Like
beats. I mean, pretty much
Tipico,
all of them. The mambo and the
right?
cha 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 and all that stuff. So when I came to New York, I found myself. I think there were maybe two other guys that I ran into, bass players, who could play Latin music and jazz to a certain extent, and so therefore I started getting work as a Latin player, and I guess my name got around, and Willie called me to join the band, and in that band was the fantastic Carlos Patato Valdez. And what a fabulous person he was.
Really, huh?
And he took me under his wing when we went to California for 2 months. We roomed together, and it was just a fabulous thing.
Yeah, and then from there, now you had a couple of big band experiences.
Yeah.
A friend of mine said, well, there's a pattern from Berkeley to Woody or Buddy to Oblivion. And you didn't, you know, you didn't take that route, but I've known.
Well, as a matter of fact, I did 2/3 of that. I did Woody Herman and some other big bands too, but in name, Woody Herman was a big one. And I followed that with Buddy Rich, but I continued and then wound up playing with Thad Mel. I took Richard Davis's place in that band.
Right, I do kind of even remember that.
Yeah.
Now, with Woody's band, was Sal Nistico on the band at the time, or?
Yes, he was, and he sat all the way on the right-hand side of the bus, and I sat all the way on the left-hand side. So we became friends. We got to know one another, and I have a funny jazz story if you'd like to hear it.
Oh, I sure would. He was a wonderful friend of mine too.
So we're doing a hit and run, and for those of you who don't know what that is that usually, the band would play a concert and then we go to a hotel and sleep. And then the next day get on the bus and go to the next gig. But sometimes during the routing, there would really be no time. So what the bus would do, we'd get finished with one week, we'd get on it and the driver would drive all night and keep going in the morning so we could get there to the next gig, because that's the amount of time we needed, or we were restricted to get there. So the band had been doing things like this for years. And so we got to a spot, I don't remember where, someplace in the middle of the country. And the driver pulled up in front of a White Castle or some hamburger joint so we could have a lunch. And Sal, who was very fast on the saxophone, but he'd take short little steps and walk slow. He jumped out of the seat before the bus stopped and he got to the front door. As soon as the door opened, he jumped out and I could see through the windshield him trotting to the corner, making a left turn and disappearing. So we're there half an hour. Maybe there's a 5-minute grace period. The driver's getting ready to close the door. Anyway, here I see Sal. He's trotting, he trots back, he gets in the bus, he comes back, falls in the seat. And I said, man, what's up with this? And he says, oh, the funniest thing in life. I said, what? He says, well, out here, he says, you can still go to the drugstore and you can buy the cough syrup that's got codeine in it. He says, yeah, it's got codeine in it, but you don't need a prescription. I said, yeah, so? He said, but what the pharmacist gives you a book where you have to sign your name on it, right? I said, yeah, and? He said, well, guess whose name was on the line before I had to sign? And I said, I don't know whose. He said, mine from a year ago. Man, that's a killer story, man.
Yeah, Sal was classic. We talking about, by the way, I didn't mention when I said Sal, we're talking about the great Sal Nistico, who was just such a wonderful tenor player and, a very deep musician. He kind of was like an actor that got typecast. Everybody thought of him as a big, fast, big band saxophone player, but man, he could play with a quartet and play some very deep stuff. I got a Sal story too while we're on it. This is funny. Sal was also notorious, let's say, for his use of narcotics. He was actually very funny because I don't know how he could stay strung out and weigh 300 pounds. He was the fattest drug addict.
He was able to do it because he didn't stay in town. He lived on the bus. That's why.
That was it, right? He just so he ate fast foods and he would do that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
So Sal is traveling now. In the end of his life, he was living in Switzerland, teaching at the jazz school in Bern, but he was often traveling through Italy. So Sal told me this story. He said he was traveling through, and it turned out there was a certain season in Italy where this flower, Omnipopola, I think the flower that Jimmy Dorsey wrote the song for, which is a poppy plant, was in bloom. And Sal found, God bless Mr. Scientist, Sal found that if he bought these flowers and he scraped them a certain way, he could take the poppy part of it and make himself basically an opium tea. So he said he bought an extra suitcase, a small, and he said he would go to the florist, and he'd say, "Oh, that plant looks very interesting." And the guy said, "Yes, well, it's in season now, and this and that." He'd say, "How many would you like? How many would you like?" And Sal would say, "How many do you have?" And so then he came back to Switzerland with a whole suitcase full of these poppy seeds,
Mm,
and said, he found this wonderful tea that cured his headaches, and talked his way into the border, and
mm,
that was Sal.
mhm,
But
mhm.
so he was on the band, and that was who else was Albert Daly wasn't on the band at that point, was he?
No, no, but there were some guys that you would know, and one was Frank the Carry,
Oh yeah.
and who's the fellow that has the Coltrane tapes that he's finally let loose? He's what, 90 years old now. He's up, I think, in the Boston area. What's his name? He came on the band. I can't remember his name right now, but then Bill Chase, the lead trumpet player, he was there. Harry Hall was playing jazz trumpet, and the piano player was oh God, what's his name? Uh, oh, oh gosh, I'm sorry, I can't think of it right
Oh,
now. Anyway,
time does that kind of thing.
John Hicks.
Oh, John Hicks.
John Hicks. There you go.
Wow.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Doing very well. Yeah. And yeah, well, the first time I heard Albert Daly, he was with Woody.
Mhm.
And Woody said, "And now, ladies and gentlemen, our other big band." And the whole band left the bandstand and let Albert play Yesterdays.
Mhm.
And that changed my life.
Mhm.
We became very close. Um, Later on, not then. I didn't even approach him then, but.
Mhm.
So now you've got Willie Bobo, and you're doing some Latin things, and now there's a couple of things in here that are interesting. You went with Nina Simone. Is that what happened chronologically? Kind of,
Yes,
you ended up going with Nina Simone.
right.
So that must be an interesting trip. I know she was. I never met her or anything. I heard her perform, on several occasions, and I know she was deeply troubled in some ways. But can you give me an idea of what that whole experience was about for you, and what she was like, and how you came about doing that and everything?
I was playing a gig, I believe, with Steve Marcus and Larry Coryell and Bob Moses. It was an afternoon thing in the East Village. And on the break, this stout guy approached me and came up and he says, "I represent Nina Simone." It was her husband who was her manager. And I didn't know that at the time. He says, "I represent Nina Simone, and we're looking for a bass player. Would you be interested in auditioning?" I don't know. Did they walk into the club? Did somebody mention my name and they came to find me? I don't know. I don't know what happened.
Hmm.
But anyway, I did the audition, got the gig, and that's how that happened. And I've said this a number of times. I've had the great fortune to play with some of the most powerful musicians on the planet. And there's no one any stronger than that woman. And she could go from a feather floating in the air to a volcano exploding. And she just had the whole range. Tremendous.
And personally, how was she to to get along with? How long did you stay with her? About 2 years, right? Something like that.
Yeah, well, yeah, I stayed with her for quite a while, and then on and off for another couple of years here and there. I'd fill in, you know. But I had a wonderful relationship with her. She was always very sweet, and well, sweet might be a little too much, but very nice to me and respectful, you know. So
Oh,
yeah. Mhm.
that's nice. You mentioned Larry Coryell. Larry and I got very close later on in his life. I he went through another period of uh, he scared me, and I had worked with Chet Baker, so not too many people scared me from how high they got. And I met Larry a couple times, and I said, I think I'll stay away from that. But years later, after he got himself together, he turned into. I mean, we started to know each other, and And he was such a delightful and warm cat, and he always had time to talk to me. And we had actually planned to do a tour together right before he died. I actually went to the Iridium. He died late that night, actually, and or the next night he died. He didn't wake up, and it was funny because we'd been meaning to play, and I went and sat in with him, and he wanted to do a trio tour with Ron Carter and him and me, and no drums, and I was all excited about that, and we got this ovation. We played all the things you are, and it just we got telepathic. It was one of those moments where we knew exactly where the other one was going, and and people really loved it, and I said, this is great, we're going to have a ball, and then he was not with us anymore.
Mhm.
But
Yeah, well, I met him through the jams early on, and then Steve Marcus mentioned that I was playing with him, and he was in that band. And then he called me. His very first gig as a leader was a week at the Village Vanguard, and it was a trio, he and I and Bob Moses.
ah,
Mhm.
and yeah, yeah, he was a very warm and gentle person. I found him to be.
Yeah, well, maybe he was with you, but he wasn't that warm and gentle when I was hanging around with him.
Well, that period, that's what I said. He scared me. He was so cold and so into his, I guess you might say, solipsistic. He didn't see anything but him, and then I noticed the change in him.
Mhm.
We even talked about how he'd grown and how he'd changed, and
Mhm.
about living. And I got into some very beautiful conversations with him, and I never would have known that in the '70s that guy was there.
Mhm.
But so after Nina, it seems like you go right to Sarah Vaughan after that?
Yeah. Mhm. Yes, I was with Nina in '69, and I did some gigs with her, as I said, afterward. But in January of that was a fluke. There've been many flukes, and fluke meaning just like surprising things that happen, which are unexpected. So
Well,
I
this
had
past
worked.
life is very serendipitous.
I
That's
had I had worked with Woody already. I had done 4 months with him, and then I was doing the comedy show at the Playboy Club in New York, and he called me and he said, "I've got 2 gigs in Texas and 2 weeks at Caesar's Palace in Las Vegas. Can you do it?" And I said, "Boy, this is my opportunity," because I was really quite frustrated at that point. Because, yeah, I had a good gig with Nina. That was a good experience. And I had played with a lot of good players, especially in jam sessions and some gigs. I was doing a few gigs with Papa Joe,
oh man, yeah,
yeah. And that's Papa Joe Jones, the drummer.
right.
And
We did say
yeah.
that.
And so anyway, I said, well, you know what? I wasn't really getting to the top where I wanted to be. And I said, well, let me go to LA and see what's happening. So I got in the car, I drove to Texas and did those 2 gigs with Woody, and then drove on to Las Vegas and played those 2 weeks. Well, the very first night of the gig at Caesar's Palace, 2 amazing things happened. One was when the gig was over that first night, backstage, I'm packing up my stuff, getting ready, to split. This short guy with red hair walks up to me, and first thing he says to me, he says, "My name is Red Rodney." And I said, "Oh, wow, a great trumpet player who played with Charlie Parker, right?" He said, "There's a girl here who wants to meet you." So she became my girlfriend.
That's Red.
Yeah, and every time I'd see him after that, "Perla, you owe me, man." But the other thing that happened that night was somebody said there was going to be his jam session, and Vegas being a 24-hour town, the jam session started at 6 o'clock in the morning. So I said, okay. So I stayed up and I went to the jam session. I asked to sit in. I played one tune, and the guy who was running the jam session, I didn't know. His name was Gus Mancuso, from upstate New York, but he was living in Vegas doing shows and stuff. And he had been up to that point Sarah Vaughan's bass player. And he came up to the stage, and I'll remember these words for as long as I live. He said, man, he said, you play great. Would you like to have a gig with Sarah Vaughan? And I said, because I was so into Coltrane and Parker and Elvin and Miles, I said, she's a singer, right?
You might say so, yeah.
Boy, what a singer. Oh my God. So anyway, I rehearsed, went to Puerto Rico and played a gig with her, and that was it. I stayed with her for a full year. And halfway through, the first thing was I got about a quarter of the way into the year, the piano player and the drummer weren't really there. They weren't really making it. And I was able to get Jan Hammer to come and play keyboard. And then about in the middle of the year, I was able to get Jimmy Cobb to come and play drums. And that was a great trio. And we had so fun, those guys. It was a constant laugh,
Yeah, now I got to hang out with her one night. It was very funny with in Belgium. We played opposite her at the Middelheim Festival when I was with Chet Baker, and I was about 23, and George Mraz hung with us, and Babs Gonzalez and Sarah. And I was living in this pharmacy with Chet, Jacques Pelzer's place.
Oh, the famous place.
The famous place.
Oh, yeah. There's a Stone and Lion story about that. But go ahead.
We got to get to that. His nickname among the cats was Dr. Z. And Jacques was actually a pretty good alto player.
Yeah, and his daughter was a drummer.
Micheline, right. Yeah. And she's on the Wayne Shorter record, Moto Grosso Feo. And, we played with her and experimented in the pharmacy. And so we're there, and Babs, that's right. So we had hung out with Sarah, and Babs had gotten us some goodies the night before. And the next day, I had a girlfriend that Chet hooked me up, introduced me to, and we were pretty intense with each other, named Florence Thomas, who was the daughter of René Thomas.
Ah, yeah.
The guitarist who had just died that year, earlier in the year. And so we had a pretty intense, so the phone was in the pharmacy, and I was sitting there, and I'm waiting for a phone call from Florence, and the phone rings, and I hear on the other end, hello. Oh, we'd had a delightful time with Sarah. She told us stories, and she was just, I found her, I wouldn't want to be her boyfriend, but, but she was very, very good company, I found. I mean, did you hang with her and she seemed to like to hang out.
There's nobody on the planet that hung out more than her.
No, she was a hanger all the way,
Complete. I mean, we'd stay up finish the gig and stay up all night. And one time we were doing a gig at Mr. Kelly's in Chicago. We stayed up all night into the next day, there was stuff to keep us awake.
Right, of course.
And
she enjoyed that.
It comes to around 4:00 in the afternoon of the next day, and she calls the club and says, I still remember the sound of her voice. She could make it so sweet.
That's right.
And she said, I'm not feeling well today. I won't be able to play.
Well, there's a little bit like that. So the phone rings, and it's like, hello, Bob. Oh, yes, we had a delightful time last night. That was a lot of fun. Yeah, man. Is Babs around? Do you think he's around? I said, well, I saw him around. Let me check. So I go, hey, Babs. And then Babs comes out of his room. I say, Sarah Vaughan's on the phone. And Babs comes out without a stitch of clothing on and starts doing this. And so I go to the phone and I say, Sarah, he must have stepped out for a moment because he's not answering when I call him. Anything I can convey? Can I message or anything? She says, why, yes, you certainly can. And then she proceeded to swear and launch into a diatribe that
Oh,
would shock a sailor. You tell that jive ass motherfucker cocksucker, blah 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 blah, that he can blah blah blah. That shit he gave us ain't shit. It ain't the shit we had last night. I don't know what the fuck he's trying to. And she goes on
oh
like this.
man.
And you know what the funny part was, Gene? I tell you this story. It's just so funny because while she's swearing and hollering and talking about how mad she is at Babs, I'm transfixed because it's Sarah Vaughan's voice.
Mm,
It's still beautiful,
yeah.
even though she's using this language
Mm.
that I've rarely ever heard a woman or a man use.
Yeah.
And but you know, so that must have been nice. Now, um, that and you left the band now. So then you're with Sarah. You're for a couple of years. You're kind of
No, just 1 year, 1970, January to December.
okay.
Hmm.
And so when you left her, where what was your next step?
The following January, I got the call from Elvin,
Okay, so there's a big
1971, January.
so 1 year in between you're freelancing and you're and,
No, no, I said 70 with Sarah and 71 with Elvin right away.
oh, right away. So 70
Yeah,
and 70 with Sarah, and then right away.
right.
Well, how did that come about? Had you sat in with Elvin? I mean, a lot
I
of people.
sat in with Elvin twice, or three times actually. The first time when I was still trying to be a piano player, went to New York from Boston, and I heard he was playing I already knew that I wanted to play with this guy. And I went to the old 5 spot and he was playing there. It was late at night. He was drunk at the bar. And I said, Mr. Jones, can I sit in? He said, yeah, let the piano player play one tune and then you come up. So that's what happened. They played one tune and he called me up and I sat at the piano and he said to me, he says, what you want to play? And I says, nothing too fast. He said, me neither. So that was one. Then I became a bass player. And then the next time I sat in was at Pookie's Pub. And Wilbur Little was the bass player at that with Joe. And then, I don't know, some months later, I went by and I sat in again. But I don't think Elvin connected with me or whatever, So then I was in with Sarah Vaughan in where the hell were we? Oh, I was in Boston playing a Latin gig with David Earl Johnson, the conga drummer. And I had my electric bass. That's what I was doing on that gig. And I'm standing in the middle of the afternoon and at the old Berkeley School lobby, and the phone call comes in, and the receptionist sings out to me. I was standing there with some friend. He says, it's WGBH TV, and it's Elvin Jones, and he needs a bass player right now. Whoa, man, I ran out to the car, put my foot on the floor. Thank goodness there weren't any cops around. I got to the TV station. I knew where to go. Went in, they had an Ampeg baby bass amplifier there, and I'm trying to get it, plugging in. I get there like 15, 18 minutes before a live TV show, and it's just Elvin and Joe Farrell. What happened was Jimmy went to New York to, I don't know what. He missed the plane, so that's why they were looking for a bass player. So I'm trying to get a sound on it. Elvin is pissed. You can see he's pissed about that. He's now put in this situation playing with this white guy, who probably doesn't know shit from Shinola about, what we're doing.
Not happy.
And I wasn't really sure what tunes they were going to play, but Joe was cool. He called it blues and so forth. And he's singing the melody and it's going one ear and out the other. Anyway, bang, next thing I know, we're playing. And I have a copy of this thing. I went back and you can hear at some points I kind of drift off the time a little bit. But for the most part, I got in the center of his beat, So when the opportunity came with Wilbur Little, that's when he called me. So I think it came from that TV thing that he heard that I had the beat that he could deal with,
Yeah, that's interesting. So then you stayed with him, and the first ones were the first band he said was Joe and Frank Foster.
Correct, quartet, yeah.
And that band kind of took a big change of direction. I think there's a big change in the direction when it becomes Liebman and Grossman.
Absolutely.
Uh, that was, I guess, from even repertoire wise and everything was probably quite.
Yeah, well, what happened was that Elvin landed a gig in Ottawa, Canada over Christmas and New Year's, right? This was like 1971 into 1972. So we went up there and the snow was above the cars, but we played that gig and we rehearsed 10 days, 5 days the first week and 5 days the second week, and almost all new material. Steve brought in a thing or two, Liebman brought in a bunch, I brought in a bunch, and we got that music together. And then we came back to the States, and then by that fall, in September, we went out to Los Angeles and played live at the Lighthouse, and it got recorded. And that record was a big statement that a lot of saxophone players really got turned on by that.
Yeah, that was a different, a different direction. It was sort of the extension of Coltrane's.
Yes. Yeah. In fact, in a radio, I have a copy of it as well. I did a radio interview. I mean, I went along. I don't think I did any talking, but at some point, Elvin said, and like I say, I got a copy of him saying it. He says, after John Coltrane comes Steve Grossman.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
Well, now Steve, there is a character that
Oh, boy.
Very unusual guy. We kind of were around New York as teenagers at the same time, and he was playing alto. And Pete Yellen.
Oh, yeah.
Pete Yellen was not nice to me. He'd say, "Yeah, you think you're good, but Steve Grossman's much better than you." He would say that. He'd say,
That's not very friendly.
He was not friendly to me. Yeah. He, I don't know. We won't have to discuss Pete. We became more friendly later in life. But he was just always telling me that there's this kid, Steve Grossman, and like he's better than you are. And I said, okay, well, I got something to aspire to, and I did hear him, and we were just different from each other. He was very into Phil Woods and Cannonball, and I was a little bit more Bird. Lee Konitz was affecting me. So, I was never competitive with Steve just because I didn't feel that way. Plus also when I would play these sessions with Dave and Bob Berg and Steve and Mike Brecker and all these guys, because I was an alto player, Steve was already playing tenor, and my influences were more like Bird and Sonny Rollins and Konitz and this and that. I don't think I threatened. They all were so busy trying to tear each other apart and trying to whatever little competitions they had, which were constructive competitions. They didn't want anybody to sound bad, but they wanted to sound as good as the next one, and they all sounded great. And I got a lot of whatever Coltrane influences in my playing through osmosis of hanging out with those guys. But Steve was when I sat in with you guys. One time I sat in with you at the jazz workshops. The only time I played with Elvin. So I remember that because everybody used to sit in with him, and I just didn't want to be another guy standing in line. And plus, they were playing very modal stuff, and I didn't think I played that stuff that well compared to the way that those guys did. So Elvin called some modal song, and I don't think I impressed him very much. But Steve turned to me, and said, "See you Sunday at Train's house." And that was our exchange. Years later, we got to know each other. And I remember having a very funny conversation with Steve. We were talking about women. And Steve said, I've never actually left a woman. I've never initiated a breakup. I said, really? He said, yes, they do that. But I supply the subterfuge. He said, they leave me through subterfuge. and what was your impression of, trying to, of relating to Steve, because finally, toward the end of his life, we hung out in France together, and we did get to relate to each other, and he was a little more communicative, but I couldn't get through to him, what was your?
Yeah, they really, he was I mean, I've seen this with a few of the young players that have an abundance of talent that people then start going, wow, and I think it's difficult for many of these people that have so much talent that they're being deluged by all these, people wanting to hang out with them and wanting to know, and that kind of like build a wall around themselves. And that's what I sense from Steve. But we spent countless hours together jamming. He, Don Elias, and I, and very often Jan Hammer at my loft, hours and hours. I have just tapes and tapes of us playing and just experimenting. And it was always about the beat, about swinging with us, whereas Lieb, and I think you said something earlier in this conversation, he was in a scene to be more avant-garde, to be more playing free music. But what we did was we wanted to whack that beat, so
Steve had incredible
but
talent.
there wasn't really much conversation about life or even music. We just get together and hit. That was our thing.
Yeah, I mean, well, one of the first things that really knocked me out about Steve was that, the most distinctive thing I thought in his playing, though there were a lot of distinctive things, but his time feeling was just
Killing, solid as a rock.
Yeah, that was such a strong thing.
Yeah.
Now, you guys, that band was together for quite a while, the Stone Alliance band. I remembered hearing a story, either Don Elias told it to me, or maybe it was the musician's grapevine, that when you guys were down in Brazil, I think Steve left his tenor in a bakery.
No, as the
And he went
story
back and got it. He found it, I think.
No, well, yes, he did, but the actual story that I know, because I was there with them.
Right, I don't have it right, but I know I heard something like that.
There was something like that. Yeah, there was a party somewhere and everybody got high as a kite and they all passed out or something like this. And when he woke up, his saxophone was gone. And so he came back to the hotel where we were staying. His saxophone's gone. And I called Paulo Moura, who was
He was a good friend of mine.
Oh yeah, good.
Paulo, a
good.
wonderful alto player. He taught me how to play chorinho.
Yeah, okay. So he was very well known in the scene and he put the word out somehow. And then we're sitting in the hotel and a phone call came in and Paolo was on the phone. He says, tell Steve to go to this corner at this time. And I went with Steve and we're standing on the corner and this car drives up, the window rolls down, somebody hands a tenor saxophone case out the window to Steve and there it was. So Paulo Moura was the guy who was able to get it back. Yeah.
That makes sense. Paulo was something. Yeah, his girlfriend, Jessy Moretsky, who was a beautiful dancer of German origin, who they kind of were, people have multiple relationships. Let's say in Brazil is, it's a hot country, and everybody's kind of
Hot.
Hot. Yeah. So I actually had introduced them, and their relationship lasted for quite a while. I was down there for 7 months in 1974. I was working with Johnny Alf. I don't know if you knew Johnny Alf. They called him O Pai do Bossa Nova, the father of Bossa Nova, and Lucio Alves. And I got to know Paulo, and he wanted me to stay. I went back to join Chet Baker again, but he wanted to do a record with 2 altos and the nucleus of a samba school. And I wish I'd have done that with him. But, he was a beautiful person.
Mm-hmm.
So tell me about you said you ended up spending 6 months in South America with Stone Alliance, right? And how did that come about? And was that like your first kind of real tour with the band, or what?
Well, prior to that, I wouldn't want to skip over my my next experience that I had after Elvin, and that was in 1974. I spent about a year, and then I did a few gigs afterwards with Sonny Rollins.
Oh, I was gonna get to that.
Yeah, but that was before Stone Alliance.
All right, so let's not go there. Let's. You also had one night, one experience with Frank Sinatra.
Oh yeah, that was yeah. I can tell you that story as well. Yeah, yeah. Mm.
So, well, let's keep. We're going chronologically. So now the Elvin thing, you did that for let's
2.5 years
two and
solid.
a half years.
Mhm.
And when and why did your next gig after Elvin was, had you
Sonny.
started playing electric bass?
Yeah,
You kind of did that a little earlier, right? You were into that kind of at the beginning of people starting to do that.
yeah, yeah. I mean, I played electric right. I don't know, pretty much when I took up the upright. It wasn't long after that I got an electric bass because I wanted to be able to play both.
Right. And you played a lot of electric with Sonny, I think.
It was only electric.
That's how I recall. And I
Mhm.
wondered, was that Lucille's idea, or did you want to do that, or how did that, come about that you ended up being electric?
I don't know if it was mentioned, but I don't know how it came about exactly, but I guess I went to the first, maybe he said it. I don't recall that. Maybe he said, bring your electric at the audition.
So how did that come about with Sonny? So you left Elvin, and
I
the
don't
next
know. I got a phone call from Sonny. He said, you want to audition? I need a bass player. That was it. Yeah.
and
So I did the audition and I got the gig.
and you were about a year and a half, 2 years with Sonny, right?
No, I was 1 year, I think, or maybe not quite, maybe it was 9 or 10 months. And then I played a few gigs afterward with him. Yeah.
And who was on the band when you were with Sonny?
Yoshiaki Masuo, the
Right.
guitarist.
Yeah, well,
Right.
I introduced Sonny to
And
Mako. Yeah.
David Williams, the from New Orleans,
Well,
who had
David
that,
Lee.
yeah, and he had that
David Lee, the
March,
drummer. Yeah.
yeah, he had that March stuff together, from New
Second
Orleans.
line thing.
Yeah, yeah. I had a lot of fun with him.
He was a good
And
guy.
what was very unusual, we did this tour of Europe. It was the best tour I ever did. The money was good. We stayed in great hotels. We went for 3 weeks and we only played 7 concerts. So we'd be 3 days in each city. It was great. Just play one concert and then we'd have 2 days off, or 1 day off and play a concert,
Uh-huh.
and it was really great. But in that band was Rufus Harley.
The bagpipe player.
He was playing bagpipes and soprano,
And he would play Swing Low, Sweet Chariot.
and he had these bishop uniforms, with the big tall hats, and these capes. I don't know if they call
Scotch
capes.
clad. They
You
were
know, with
Scotch
with a
clad
big. He,
cape.
he had one that was white with a big blue cross on the front, and he had another one, the baby blue, that had a big white cross on it. And then he sometimes wear the kilts and stuff too.
That's how I remember him. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. There's interesting fellow.
Yeah, I didn't know him very much at all.
Yeah.
But so did you do the Grand Parade de Jazz that year? Was that well, the Nice Festival?
No,
Okay, because
I don't think so. I don't think so. I'd have to look back at my schedule. I could tell you every place we played, but that doesn't sound familiar, although I could have forgotten.
yeah, no, because I remembered I was at the festival with Chad and David Lee, and I hung out quite a bit.
Oh, yeah, not Williams. That's the bass player.
Right,
Sorry.
right, David
Yeah,
Lee.
David Lee. Right, right,
Yeah.
right, right.
I don't know if I heard that he has left. He's no longer with us,
Yeah, it's a couple of years back. Yep.
and he had some psychological problems.
Yeah, that he seemed to have gotten over, although I didn't see him after that. But he did come back to New York. He was in New York for a while, but I never hooked up with him again.
Yeah, it's funny because I never saw the dark side of David. I knew him as a buddy, and we would hang out and try to find women together, and we were just two young guys pursuing life, and we played quite a bit together. And then all of a sudden, he just wasn't on the scene anymore, and then he
Yeah.
told me he'd had problems and was institutionalized, and
Mhm.
I, that was sad. By the way, Matsuo says hello. He called me yesterday.
Oh, good, good.
He's
Yeah.
living in Hawaii part of the time.
Hello back.
I will. And so, what are some experiences? What was your impression of playing with Sonny, and how did it feel to you? And you got any anecdotes about that, or
I can tell you this, that I might be exaggerating a little bit, but I think maybe if we had 10 or 12 words in those 9 or 10 months that we were together, that was it, and it would be like, what gate are we leaving from?
really?
Yeah, there was no conversation, no talking. It was just get on the stage and hit. That's what it was.
Oh, that's interesting because
Yeah.
Was Lucille with him most of the time, or
Yeah, the whole time that I was there, yes, he was there. The bagpiper only did that European tour. The rest of the time it was a quartet.
so? So now from Sonny, is that where the Stone Alliance story kind of really?
Yeah, 2 years later, 76. That's when that started.
So you're leaving Sonny, and then you're playing around New York, playing with different cats and doing that kind of thing. And now your record company and all that comes after all that.
No, it doesn't. No, the record company started when I joined Eldon in 71. When Liebman got in the band, we were playing gigs someplace. I don't remember if it was Detroit or Toronto or Chicago, someplace. And after the first night of the gig, we were in the hotel and I see Lieb in the lobby, and I hadn't spoken with him. I mean, we played the gig, but now I saw him and I said, "Yo, man, what's up? What's happening?" He says, "Oh, I'm so frustrated." He says, "I've been shopping this tape around of my trio with Frank Tusa on bass and Bob Moses on drums. We call the band Open Sky. And I've sent it around to all the record labels and nobody wants it." And I said, "Well, I'm curious. I'd like to listen to it." So he took me up to his room and he puts on a cassette and I listened to it and I'm impressed. I said, "Wow, this is really something really nice." And it just, Bob, it just came over me like a number of things in my life. A thing comes into my head and I say, "Okay, I'll do it." He says, "What do you mean?" I said, "I'll put it out." And that started 6 months of me trying to understand, how do you make an LP? So I had to learn about, lathe cutting from the tape, and then the 3 metal process of making the records. I had to learn the color process, 4-color process of printing album covers, and then I finally make this first record. And my mom and I went over and in her Thunderbird to the pressing plant in Paterson, New Jersey, and I take 500 albums and put them in the trunk in the back seat, and I crack one of the albums open and boxes open, and I've got the album on my lap as I'm driving home. I'm so pleased with myself that I was able to do this. Guess what? That was the easy part. Now what? I got 500 pieces of plastic. What do I do with them? That's when the real shit started, man. Trying
That
to
was
figure
PM
out
Records, right? PM Records.
PM Records, and that's when it was like, I got to sell this stuff. That's what I made it for. So now I was reaching out to radio stations throughout the entire country, finding the reviewers in newspapers and magazines, sending records out to them, getting reviews, and eventually it started working. In fact, my 5th record, which was with Elvin, was a trio record called On the Mountain with Elvin and Jan Hammer. I sold, that was the best seller I ever had, was 10,000 records. Now, when you think of 10,000 records for a pop album or rock and roll, it's nothing. It's like grain of sand on the beach, you know. But for
Yes, that's the
me,
break-even point, isn't it?
the 10, well, no, I made money on that one because
Huh.
it didn't cost that much. You know, I was always careful on the expenditures and working with musicians to say, like, you know, what can we do here? I want you to feel comfortable and so forth and so on. And I made it work. But, you know, I'm up to, I'm working on my 61st album right now. And I tell you what, there's really no sales at all to speak of. You know, no, some people still buy CDs, right? But where it's at, and some people will, the major sales, which are minor, are MP3 purchases. But there's also money now coming in from streaming, and I'm getting checks regularly on streaming. You know?
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
And this is your 61st record for PM Records for your own
Yes. Yeah.
company. That's quite a
Mhm.
substantial.
Yeah. One man show.
Yeah, well, and I think I know Paul Bley had improv records. You know, he told me we were close friends, and he was telling me he did essentially a lot of the same type of
Right.
idea. He said when you go to Europe, he said bring reels of tape. He said don't bring as many clothing. He said just stick them. And that was when you had to have these big reels of tape with you
Mm-hmm.
and go into studio and record as often as you can. And
Mm-hmm.
you know, so but I think you said something about that, like then you realized you didn't know very much about the music business, and that you talked to Chick, and Chick gave you some advice, and then you went to Bill Krasilovsky, who
Right.
wrote that book, This Business of Music,
Right.
which most cats have at least glanced through, maybe not studied it in depth.
Uh,
Let's talk a little bit about that, because that stimulated this whole interest and your expertise, really, in that you're teaching classes and everything in the actual music business.
right. Yes. Um, yeah, what happened was that when I joined Elvin, one of the first things we did was record. And he said, if you have any tunes, bring them to Rudy Van Gelder's. And I did. And we recorded 2 of my songs. And after the session, I went home and I called Chick and I said, we just recorded with Elvin. I got 2 tunes on there. I said, what do I have to be concerned with here, business-wise? He says, well, you got to copyright the songs. I says, oh, I've done that already. That much I knew. He said, well, then you have to get a music publisher. And I said, what's that? I had no idea what that was. So he said, call this guy Krasilovsky. So I called Krasilovsky, and one thing led to another. He says, why do you want to get a music publisher? Why don't you publish it yourself? So that's what I did. I started a publishing company. And what else? Where was I
That
going?
kind of set you on the road to learning more and more about the actual music business.
Yeah, this is before I started the record company. So I really, you know, was getting involved in the business. And I guess because when Liebman said to me, I can't get this record, nobody wants it, I already knew enough, I guess, to say I'll do it, because I felt confident that I could, or at least I was hoping that I
You got
could.
the inclination to do it, you know, and
Yeah,
you're strong-willed, and you could push that through.
yeah.
I think also you had a studio with Jan Hammer. For those people who are listening and maybe not know who Jan is, I would say his most recognizable accomplishment, at least to our generation, was having been the person that did the music for Miami Vice, and
Correct.
really being the first person to incorporate synthesizers and that type of thing into a regular studio use of in a television series. Could one say that?
Oh, I have no idea. I would think that there were other people doing that, just especially some of those rockers. I would imagine some others were doing some stuff, but he certainly was in the forefront, because Bob Moog from, you know, from the Moog thing, and Tom Oberheim from his stuff, they would come to our studio in upstate New York and bring their prototypes to Jan.
That's funny. I have a Bob Moog story that's really kind of interesting. My father played the theremin, And that's right. We had one in the house. And as a
Oh
little
man.
boy, I would sit behind the theremin. And
Oh
that
man.
was my, along with the piano, that was my first instrument.
Mm.
So I remember being like 3 years old, 2 years old, and sitting there and playing with my dad's theremin.
Wow.
But I remember my mother and father having this huge fight that my dad actually heard the theremin. It was on a Harry Revel record. Harry Revel was a songwriter who wrote "Did You Ever See a Dream Walking?" and "Love Thy Neighbor" and a few tunes like that. Not Ravel, not Maurice, but Harry.
Mm.
And he did a record called Perfume Music with a guy named Professor Dr. Hoffman, who played the theremin. And it was like playing these simple themes over that. And my dad heard it and he was fascinated. My dad was playing with Tommy Dorsey.
Mm.
He was a lead trumpet player. My father
Ah.
had his own big band in Boston. I think I told you that Chick's father, Armando, and my dad used to play
Oh
together
yeah,
and
yeah,
do
yeah,
that,
yeah.
so
Hmm.
they knew each other. But so my dad gets fascinated with the theremin. So he's looking all over to find one of the original theremins. There was in the back of Popular Mechanics, there was you could make a theremin, but my dad wanted to find there were only 25 of them made and only 10 of them got to America. And finally he looked for it and somebody found one and they found it and my dad bought this theremin, but it didn't work. So he asked around and he wanted to know if there was somebody who was maybe into engineering and music.
Mm.
Recommended this guy,
Bob
Bob
Moog.
Moog,
Mm.
who was an MIT student at the time.
Yeah, wow.
So he fixed my dad's theremin.
Wow.
Now, about 4 or 5 years later, my dad gets a phone call. And this is what my brother and I refer to as the mover luck, was the combination of sometimes bad circumstances, but often bad judgment. And we, it's Bob Moog, and he says, Jimmy, I want to go into business. And if you've got, I think it was something like $5,000 or $4,000 at the time, this is the early mid 50s. He says, I want you to be my partner. And my father says, what's the business? He says, electronic instruments. I've got, and my father says, it's got to be like the hula hoop. It'll be
Oh
a fad. It'll,
man.
it'll never
Whoa.
last.
Oh
And,
man.
and I remember my mother and father having this argument and my mother telling my father he had no foresight. Because I
Opa.
remember thinking foresight was such an interesting word. When you
Wow.
were 3 or 4 years old, foresight. I wonder what that is.
Yeah.
And so he did not do it. Now, the
Wow.
irony of the story is when I was 16 and we moved to New York in 1968, one of my dad's things was he was going to get back into music. He had been selling and doing some other things, non-musical things, playing on the weekends when he could. Doesn't happen. Now he was going to get into New York and try to do music. And if he didn't make it as a trumpet player, he still had friends that he'd known, from the bands and all that. He was going to, the theremin was his ace in the hole because that was the thing. Nobody played that, and he was going to really be get to use that in the studios. He'd done the Ernie Kovacs show and everything with the theremin, and you know. So when he gets to New York, he finds out that there's this new machine
Oh man.
called the synthesizer that
Opa.
had the theremin stop. Now the theremin, you had to stop each note. You couldn't play really fast. Though there was one lady, Clara, who could play it fast, but very few people. But on the keyboard, you could get the theremin sound, and you could be running around like Coltrane. And so my dad, it turned out to be his downfall.
Did he go home and apologize to your mother?
They were well divorced by that time.
Oh, okay, okay.
It was merciful for everybody
Yeah.
involved. Now the other thing, oh yes, you were going to tell me a story. I was thinking we were talking about Dr. Z. Jacques Pelzer, as cats used to say, whenever something's wrong with me, I go and visit Dr. Z. And, we all had a little period of, I said, living in the pharmacy with Chet Baker was like being on the North Pole with Santa Claus himself.
Yeah.
And, Jacques and Chet, and 23 years old, and, I survived and I was fortunate. But, what, tell me, if you don't mind, your Stone Alliance story and your little experience with Jacques.
Yeah, well, I think it was mentioned briefly, but just let me say, we put the band together. We had a few gigs in the States, and then I landed a job through the State Department again, because I had made that connection to bring Elvin to Chile. And then we went on a 15-day tour of Chile, Grossman and Elias and myself. And I met this fella at the embassy, and we started sending telexes around to all the countries, and we wound up staying in South America for 6 months.
Right now, was
And
that the Fine Wine Trio, or you were already
no,
Stone?
this is Stone Alliance.
That was Stone Alliance,
Stone
right?
Alliance, yeah. And then so we finished that. Grossman wouldn't come. I had gigs in Central America that we had to cancel because he said, I'm staying here with this lady, and I'm going to marry her before I come back to the States. So he was there for a while, but then we came back, and then that fall we went to Europe, and we did a tour of Europe. And at the end of the tour, we had 2 weeks at Ronnie Scott's club. And actually, we had gigs after that too in Scandinavia. So the first week was opposite Joe Henderson, and the second week was opposite Stan Getz. And I tell you, the way Grossman was playing, phew, man, he would have burned those guys up. Not to take anything away from the two of them, but Grossman was so hot. But he went to Jacques' place and then said, I don't have any money to get to London. And we had been through so many trials and tribulations with that guy in Brazil, and, threatened with going to jail and fights and all this kind of stuff. And it was just like, I just had enough, And I said to Don, I said, look, I'm done. So I had to cancel those gigs, and that was the end of that band.
Oh,
But so that's the Jacques Pelzev story.
that's
Yeah.
that's sad. Like,
Yeah. Should I have somehow managed to get him there? Maybe I should have. I don't know.
I don't know. Steve was one of those cats that, like, a friend of mine used to say, he just can't take yes for an answer.
Yeah. Mm,
And
yeah.
he was.
But we reconstituted, we a little while later, we put a band together with Kenny Kirkland and Kenny Werner, 2 keyboard players, and they both of them played electronics. That was I wished I had recorded something. I didn't get anything recorded with them. That was so fun, that band. And then we kept with Kenny, and we got Bob Mincer, and then we did a bunch of tours with that band.
Right. I think I caught one of the last gigs that you actually did with Steve. You and Steve, it was up in Saratoga in, it must have been like 1980 or something like that. Maybe that was just a one-time hit.
No, no, we never played together again as Stone Alliance after that.
You never did, so it wasn't
No.
Steve. Maybe it was Mincer.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, well, that was.
Yep.
Now, let's just, before we go,
Yeah.
I just want to talk a little bit about relationship, love, children,
Ah,
women.
okay.
Well, while we're on that,
Mhm.
um, you've been together, married, or whatever,
Yeah.
with the same person for a number of years.
Mhm.
How long have you been together?
Well, she's my third wife, the one I'm with now. Yeah. So on a Charlie Mariano tour with Don Elias in Europe, I met my first wife in Zurich, Switzerland, and we lived together for 7 years, and then finally got a divorce after 10. And then I met this woman
Was she Swiss? Was she a Swiss woman or a
She was
European?
Swiss, yeah, she
Right.
was Swiss. And then I met a New York City gal that was living in White House Station, New Jersey. She was a horse person, and someone had told me I could go to her farm because I was doing sound effects recording at that time for a company that made those, sound effects available for people that want to use them in various productions. And so I met her there at this farm, and she became my second wife. And that was the same thing. We lived together for about 7 years, and then there was a divorce after 10. And then I was alone well, with some friends here and there, but then I met my current wife, and we've been married since 2014. Uh, if and both of us were, older folks at that point, so they were no children. I had no children, my second wife, but my first wife and I had two kids, and we adopted both of them from Colombia.
Oh, really?
So that's a thumbnail sketch of the marriages.
Yeah, well, I mean, most cats have been around a few times, you know. I remember meeting Benny Carter in Brussels. Chet and I went to hear Benny at this club one night, and I was having a delightful conversation with him. And, finally, toward the end of the night, he finished his sets, and we were, saying, he says, well, I better get up. He said, I've got to bring a sandwich to my wife. He said, wonderful woman, very happy. I said, oh, that's great to know. Your first wife? He said, no, my fourth, but wonderful woman.
Yeah. Well, what can I say? I just thought of something. I don't know.
We were talking about the various relationships that we go through, and
Yeah, yeah,
being.
I don't know. It slipped by me. Yeah,
What's Jan Hammer doing these days?
not much. Not much. He's. I think he's not going to be performing anymore.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, I just saw him recently. When we drive up that area, we usually stop. I see him a couple of times a year. We stop by for a coffee, and it's always a very sweet conversation.
Yeah. One other thing, Charlie Mariano, did you work frequently with Charlie? And
No, no, no. We shared a girlfriend in the early days.
really?
Yeah, but yeah, we hooked up later on, and then we did this tour of Europe. We made a record, very nice record, and he was a sweet man, really a
He was a
sweet
beautiful
person.
cat.
Yeah,
I only
very.
met him once
Mm-hmm.
at a party at Mike Knox's house, and I think I've told this story before, but it's worth it. I was sitting there, and Charlie was wearing this beautiful white Nehru type silk or rayon or whatever it is, Indian kind of suit, like one of those
Mm-hmm.
beautiful threaded Indian costumes. He had that on with like a Nehru type of thing. And, he just looked great. And I was very excited to meet him because he was one of my favorite alto players. And I had a lot of questions to ask him about life and music. And he was just about living in India. He was hilarious. I said to him, in India, I was reading in Yogananda that the word for musician is in Sanskrit translates to he who sings the praises of the all in all. And was your teacher very like pure and like straight laced and this type of thing? He says, not my teacher. He said he was a great musician. He said this guy could really play that nagaswaram. He was just the Indian type of saxophone. He's a tremendous musician. He said, but unfortunately, he was a fucking drunk. Died at 30.
Wow.
He said, and Charlie had talked about how his greatest thrills in music was actually getting to play with Charlie Parker.
Mm.
And the second greatest, or the other greatest thrill he'd had, was he had to practice outside the temple.
Mm.
And then one day his teacher said, now you're ready to come into the temple.
Wow.
And he felt this was the most wonderful thing. But while we're talking, it's this big, Mike Knock had this big New York loft. He was married to a Brazilian woman at the time.
I went to their wedding.
Right. Oh, it was, yeah. Well, I believe that.
Mm-hmm.
And, so they're there and it's everybody, it's like one of those, looks like Breakfast at Tiffany's, the New York party scene, people bumping into each other. So I'm drinking red wine. And as I'm talking to Charlie, I've got this glass of red wine and somebody bumps into me and the red wine spills.
Goes on his shirt.
all over Charlie's suit, this beautiful white suit.
Uh-oh.
And Gene, I'm mortified. I'm sitting there going, oh man, one of my favorite alto players, and we're just getting to know. I go, Charlie, please send me the cleaning bill. You're here, you're in town for the week. He was going to do a week at Sweet Basil with Knock. I said, so, please send me the bill. I'll take care of it. I'm very sorry. I'm very sorry. And I'm apologizing profusely. And Charlie looks at me and says, well, I think that you should get another glass of wine,
Yeah, what else?
you
That's
know.
great.
But
Yeah.
it was, he was just so cool about it. It was,
Well, listen, if you think we're at the end, I want to share my recent axiom.
I would love to hear that.
The greatest thing that a human being can do is play music. And the greatest music that a human being can play is jazz.
I couldn't, I couldn't agree more.
Mm, mm,
I think that it's, that it's such a gift to be able to do what we do.
yeah.
I thank the Creator every day for having the ability to do it. I mean, and even with my emphysema, thank God I can still play my horn,
Amen.
and it still works.
Mhm.
It's that question of I couldn't close with anything better than that, except for a big thank you, Gene.
Oh, man, my pleasure. Thank you.
It's been wonderful to get to really sit and talk about these things.
Mhm, mhm.
And I wish you many more years of health and happiness and music
Yeah, yeah.
and life. And I'm so glad we got to do this.
Well, I'm playing with Liebman on Labor Day. Again, I'll be playing with him.
There you go.
Yeah, we're doing a festival out in Long Island. Yeah.
Oh, well, say hello. We just did 2 interviews with Dave. We had a good time.
Ah, that's great.
We actually did 2 weeks.
Mhm.
And I'd like to thank Gene again. Thanks so much. And I'd like to thank everybody that tuned in and everybody that's going to tune in and watch this in the future. And as you say, welcome to On the Real Side. And if you did enjoy this and like this, then go through whatever the process is in the internet and give us a like. And I thank Jessy Kaiser for her technical ability in putting us all together here and making everything work.
It's always a pleasure.
Yeah, and I think that just about that certainly covers all my notes here. And oh, yeah, the one thing I didn't get to know, your Frank Sinatra gig.
Ah,
What was that like? Just
okay, okay. So what happened was there was a fellow in Brooklyn, a tenor saxophonist. He just passed recently. What's his name? Maybe I'll think of it. Anyhow, I was playing in his big band, and we basically just did rehearsals. I think we may have done 1 or 2 gigs. Pat, anyway, he calls me on the phone one day and he says, I'm moving to Los Angeles. He said, if you come out that way, just look me up, get together. Pat Rizzo was his name. Yeah. And so I wind up in California and I call him up on the phone. This is like early December of 69, I believe. And I call him and I say, well, I'm in town. He says, oh, great, good, okay, welcome, blah, 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 blah. We hang up. About a half an hour later, he calls back and he says, what are you doing New Year's? And I said, I just got in town, nothing. He said, you want to play Frank Sinatra's house? New Year's Eve party. I said, sure, So hang up the phone, call my mother, my Italian mother. Mommy, you sitting down? Yes. I said, guess where I'm going New Year's Eve? She says, I don't know where. I said, I'm going to Frank Sinatra's house to play a party. There's a pause and I hear, another pause. And then she says, tell him to give you some money. Yeah, Ma. So the rest of the story is somehow I asked Pat, this is before, the GPS and all this stuff. It said, you're making your way with paper maps, trying to figure
I
out where to
remember
go.
those.
Yeah. And so, but he told me, I said, how long does it take to get to Palm Springs from where I am in Los Angeles? He said, whatever it was, an hour and a half. I don't remember the numbers. And so, okay, so I leave, and now I'm driving, and now I see um, um, a sign for Palm Springs and how many miles it is. And I see the watch, right? I am going to be late to Frank Sinatra's party.
Oh
Oh
no.
my God. I'm wondering, should I turn around and go back to where I came from? Because I don't want to wind up in Los Angeles Bay.
Yeah, right.
No, I really wasn't worried about that, but I was really concerned that I was late, So anyhow, I get there late, right? I don't know, 15, 20 minutes late from when the bands were supposed to start playing. I pull in there, these guys, standing around, put your car over there. And I got a bass from Howard Rumsey because I didn't bring my upright. I just had my electric. And I don't know what, he had a bunch of basses, but he gave me a piece of junk. The fingerboard was loose.
No.
Anyhow, I'm carrying both basses now. And I come around the corner, I see this like little walkway with lights, and I see the party of people in this building, and the band is playing, right? And I'm saying, oh my God. I take another step, and out of the darkness, it's Frank. He comes right up to me and he says, I'll take the Fender, meaning the electric bass, right? So I hand it to him, and he says, follow me. So he takes me around the side to get to the bandstand, and boom, I set up, I start playing. We play the gig at midnight. He comes around to the band and shakes our hand, and his wife gives us kisses and everything. But Rizzo recorded the night, and Frank, he said that Rizzo at that point had gotten the gig to be his musical guy for all Frank's private stuff, right? And he'd been doing it for several years. And Frank came and he sang that night. He sang 4 tunes that got recorded. And Rizzo told me, he says he never, ever sings at a party. And so I have those recordings of me with Frank Sinatra, man.
Oh, great.
Yes. So that's my Sinatra story.
That's a good story.
Yeah.
And on that, we'll say goodbye to everybody. And thank you,
Yay.
Gene.
Thank you.
All. And, we'll be in touch.
Amen.
Amen. Thanks, everybody. And good night. God bless, as Red Skelton used to say. But we mean it too. And see you all soon. Next week, we got David Schnitter.